everyone, welcome to El Vida, a podcast that centers around bringing awareness and change to the issues concerning those criminalized. I'm your host, Ariadne Brempu, and today we're diving into a brief overview of incarceration with Akira Rose. As a disclaimer, the opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the views of any of the employers of the guests or of any organizations they're affiliated with. So that being said, grab your headphones, settle in, and let's get into it. So, I thought we could start by talking about Liberation Summer Camp. Can you give me an overview of the activities you participate in there?
Absolutely. So, Liberation Summer Camp is a 5-week advocacy camp for high school aged young adults to learn more about the criminal legal system while also getting some hands-on knowledge and getting some instruction in documentary filmmaking from our partner organization, Echoes of Incarceration. So essentially, these things culminate in filmmaking projects by the end of the summer that are dedicated to learning a little bit more about the systems that we live in. This camp was started 15 plus years ago at this point by Lewis Webb. And he truly like pioneered this idea that, young people should have a say and should have a voice in, um, what happens to them in New York City, especially, right? He was the father of two young boys who were constantly being targeted by um, police, right? They were being targeted under stop and frisk policies, and when he asked them about it, they kind of like brushed it off like it was just what was supposed to happen to them. And from that day forward, he said, this is not, um, this is not right. It's not what should be happening to young kids. And so he developed this program to try and teach kids about their rights and try to teach young people about how they can make a difference in their communities and how they can make a difference in the lives of other people. And just how to spread awareness to other people and advocate against the really harsh system that we have in place in the criminal legal system.
From those projects you mentioned, do you have any examples of things that people have worked on in the past?
Absolutely. So we've done things like a Know Your Rights video, which was a kind of like game show style video that was really fun to make, but it also highlighted the fact that a lot of people don't actually know what their constitutional rights are. And so it was like a kind of fun way to get people to think about, the things that affect them on a daily basis when it comes to knowing their rights. Like if a police officer comes to you and asks to search your bag, if you do you know whether or not you have to give it to them? Do you know whether or not you have to talk to them if they come to your front door? That kind of thing. Um, we've also done videos with, you know, young or like women who have been incarcerated, people who've been incarcerated, um, on Rikers Island specifically, because in New York City, the campaign to close Rikers has been a thing that's been brewing for many years now, and Rikers has been a dangerous place for decades at this point. Um, as many prisons and jails are. So we did a video where we were interviewing women about their experiences on Rikers Island and asking them, you know, what exactly they would do, and why people think or why they think that the prison needs to be shut down, and how they survived their incarceration there. Um, we did last year a video about food deserts that you were a part of. And it was a really awesome video. It also ended up being like a little bit silly, a little bit fun, just like a way to test out how much people knew about their nutrition and how much nutrition people were able to get in a city like New York, where everything is so expensive, and where food deserts do exist.
In what ways do you think that this program helps you?
I can say that this program helps young people discover things kind of like beyond their immediate surroundings. It's really impactful for a lot of people to come to the camp and learn about the things that incarcerated people have to go through, the things that people who are criminalized or marginalized in our society have to go through. And they come away with this idea that they have the ability to change it. And so that's the biggest thing is that young people should know that they can be change makers. That's been the ultimate goal of this program.
Do you think it helps other people to hear about experiences with the criminal legal system?
I think it does help other people to hear about experiences with the criminal legal system because when you understand something that's outside of the scope of your own um, community or outside of the scope of your own daily life, it makes you want to gain further perspective in order to do something about it. Right. So I think that, by hearing stories, especially using change narratives to make a change, using storytelling to make a change, young people come away with the ability to take those stories and give them to their communities and do more with them, right? Just like you're doing right now, right? It's like this thing that we learned in the summer camp, like you've taken the things that you've learned and now you're doing something to spread even more awareness to other people, which I think is amazing.
From all these people that you've talked about the criminal legal system, do you see a common trend in how they ended up going down that path in the first place?
I can't say that there is one set common path to how people end up absorbed in the criminal legal system. I can say that we do know that there are extenuating factors that are outside of people's control, that do lead to that kind of thing. And those things are things like poverty, those are things like homelessness, those are things like, having a parent who has been incarcerated or a family member who has been incarcerated. It's being somebody who doesn't have a family or doesn't have parents. It's being somebody who um, maybe has like addiction issues, right? Or has, you know, it could be that there's several things in your life going right, and that, you know, you the thing that changes things for you is that, right, you're stopped by a cop and they decide, okay, this is the person who committed a crime just based off of profiling, which is something that has happened to one of the participants in our summer camp previously. So these things are highly racialized. They're highly they're class stratified, which means that across class, people with less income, people with less wealth are more likely to end up behind bars. And all of these things that are signals of like inequality are the things that are also signals that you might end up in a prison. There's also the school to prison pipeline, right? Which especially like young Black and Latino students end up having, things like suspensions on their record. So they have things like expulsions, and those things also make it very much more likely that they'll end up behind bars as well. I also wanted to say, because I do work with survivors of domestic abuse and domestic violence, is that, factors like early childhood abuse or domestic partner violence also significantly increases your chances of going to prison.
Do you think that making projects about topics like this is a helpful way of working through some of those traumatic experiences?
I think that this is a really good way to exercise some sort of agency over what you can do to help stop this pathway that seems to take people who are the most marginalized in our society through this path, right? Um, and it's like, right, like doing things like this, like trying to create awareness, trying to spread some sort of message about, humanization and how to change the narrative about, the kinds of people that end up behind bars. Um, those are the things that need to be done.
I remember that you told me a bit about your participation with the committee that targets policing. Would you be able to expand on what you do there?
Sure. So, the organization I work for is the American Friends Service Committee, and I'm on a committee called Community Safety Beyond Policing. And what we like to do is help people think about alternatives to relying on the police when something happens in their community. So we've done, you know, webinars and workshops with people, well, not necessarily just people who would be more inclined to call the police, but really anybody who's trying to think about their impact on their own community and trying to think about how the police impacts others, right? And so in these workshops, we kind of try to offer steps to how to get to know their neighbors, get to know people in their community, and create response groups, rapid response groups, so that they can rely on each other when something happens in their community instead of going to the police to rely on them. Because we know that if people end up calling the police to neighborhoods, that's when the threat of violence and that's when the threat of incarceration goes way up. Um, and so trying to get people to think through alternatives so that they don't have to have that moment where they go and talk to the police. That's been one of the really big things that Community Safety Beyond Policing has done, along with the Think Twice campaign. And Think Twice is also something that allows people to take a step back and think before they go ahead with making a phone call to 911 that they might regret because they could have done something themselves to de-escalate it.
It seems like you're talking a lot about this poor relationship between the police and the citizens. Do you think there's any way to rebuild that relationship?
When it comes to rebuilding a relationship between policing and citizenry, I think we have to think about the origins of policing in this country. And the origins of policing in this country is it's rooted in slavery, right? The police were a slave catching force. So if people ran away from a plantation where they were being brutalized, raped, tortured, the people who would drag them back, right? So that they could continue to exploit them. And having this kind of origin, this foundational root for the police has made it nearly impossible for that relationship to change. And I'm not going to tell you that every single police officer is horrible, but what I will say is that the system is so rotten that if you're somebody that could possibly work for a system like that, then you have to take a step back and question the kind of person that they are.
Jumping over to violence again, you've addressed some of the work that you've done with stopping violence. Can you expand on your work with the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act?
Sure. So, I've been working with an organization called Amicus Certis, and trying to think about how to get the narratives of survivors of domestic violence who have been criminalized, which what this means essentially is that these are people who have had partners, it's mostly women, honestly, who have had male partners that have been involved in some sort of violent activity, whether it be drug activity or gang activity. You know, they've had their own domestic disputes, and that person has either the abuser has either ended up making their partner an accessory to their crime, usually a murder or drug deals, things like that, or where the person who was the survivor of the violence ends up um, either killing or seriously injuring their abuser. And so being demonized for that, being criminalized for that, being kind of seen in the same light as the person who ended up doing the abusing in the first place is something that the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act takes a look at, right? It takes a look over people's entire lives, from childhood up to adulthood, and thinks about the things that they experienced at home, such as, you know, if they experience neglect or abuse from their parents, it makes them way more likely to experience that from a partner and to view it as normal as well, right? And that's the main crux of it, is that people who don't have the awareness of what has been going on for them because it's been happening for them their entire lives deserve a chance to be rehabilitated and deserve a chance to actually change in some way. Yeah, and to heal their trauma, right? Heal the trauma that they've experienced throughout their lives. Um, so that's the crux of the act. And there have been several people so far who have gotten um, a second chance at their cases and to think about yeah how to rebuild their lives past something that they had very little awareness or control over um, previously.
Do you think that as a society we've grown more understanding of violence and wanting to help it over the years?
Whether we've become more understanding, I think certain groups of people have become understanding of why people might commit violent acts and of why, there's so much violence in our society. I think that it really does stem from the fact that the state has this monopoly on violence, right? So that means, the police have total control, the police and the military have total control over what is violence and what is not. And the state has control over what is violence and what is not. But the things that aren't seen as violence are things that are structural. People might not call it violent to see a homeless person out on the street, but those are the kinds of things that lead directly to people's deaths, right? So if you can't call that violence, then um, it's kind of like how do you call somebody being shot violence? It's kind of like because people see something direct happening and they're able to call it one thing, but then when they see things that happen indirectly, they're able to push the blame onto that person instead of to rightly associate the blame with the way that the society actually is structured.
Bouncing back to what you mentioned about the police again, so do you envision like a world where there'd be no police and instead the alternative would be those communities you were talking about where everyone kind of protects each other? Do you think that's like a long-term solution or an alternative?
I don't have um, all the answers about how to change things, but what I do know is that what we have currently simply does not work for the majority of people, and it puts a lot of us at risk and in a lot of harm's way. And so I am an abolitionist, and I believe in abolishing the police and prison system. I've believed this for, many, many years now that, the solution to the violence that happens in our communities doesn't start with locking people away or disappearing them. It has to start at the root cause, right? Um, and it's usually, right, like trauma that's been inflicted on people by the state, by family, by society at large. And because we have such an individualistic and kind of like competitive and hardened view toward each other, frankly, it makes it really hard to, yeah, just go through this life as, somebody who's like a perfect citizen, right? Um, it's like at the end of the day, many people, most people, in fact, commit crimes, right? Crimes. But the people who end up being criminalized are people who have less cover, right? People who have maybe less privilege or who have less income, people who have just generally start society with like roadblocks in the way. Um, and so instead of, having as a solution locking those people away, we need to eliminate those roadblocks.
In terms of the violence you were talking about, I understand you're also working on an alternative to violence program. Could you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the AVP or Alternatives to Violence program is a very old program that essentially helps you talk to people that you know just about choosing nonviolence in your everyday life. That's something that Quakers are very, by the way, I work for a Quaker organization. Nonviolence is a value for Quakers. And so we try to work within those parameters and trying to teach people different ways to de-escalate conflicts in their lives, trying to help people take what's going on with them and seeing things from a different perspective, seeing things from a perspective of less violence, right? And we also like kind of throw into question like I said, like what is violence? Um, because people think that violence is only physical force when a lot of the times it is stuff that is completely structural, right? So like if somebody, for example, like is an immigrant in this country and they're deported, they might be facing violence by being separated from their families. They might be facing violence by being sent back to a place where they could have been a refugee or they could have been seeking asylum from. And so we have to not just look at the surface level, um, kind of like a way of thinking about violence. We have to look at it from a perspective of, or just we have to think of things in more of a holistic way, right?
What do you think causes all this violence?
The causes of violence in this society, I mean, it's very broad, and it spans many of the things that I was talking about previously, right? It's from a lack of education, it's from a lack of equity and equality in our society, like inherent inequity. Um, that exists under capitalism, right? There's the inherent inequity um, of like racial hierarchies, right? And there's just so many factors that play into what causes violence in the society, and it's honestly also um, things like greed, right? The need to acquire more and more that creates like structural violence from the top down.
In terms of youth, do you think the causes of violence are different than just general society or those same trends?
Well, yeah. So when we're thinking about acts of violence versus things like structural violence, I think it's important not to like put a barrier between those things because when you look at it from the lens of um, structural violence being sometimes a greater violence because it affects more and more people, like way more people than a single act of violence could ever harm. I think that we're able to see that um, the people typically who are committing the most violence aren't necessarily people who are doing physical things. And so I guess when it comes to young people, um, like and violence, um, it's largely based on factors that are around them, right? So it's like if you're in a family where that's kind of like a normal thing, you've experienced a lot of violence in your life, you've been abused, things like that, you'll think that those kinds of things are normal, and you'll do what you perceive as doing what you can to survive. And so yeah, it's like kind of like you just have to think about it from the perspective of somebody who um grew up in a way where things like that were kind of just normalized. Um and that doesn't make it okay, but it makes it kind of like um it's like you can understand how that kind of thing ends up happening, which is why I say like we definitely need to have some sort of healing, trauma healing happening, and rehabilitation and services for people who end up especially young people before they end up in prison or if they've already gone to jail or juvenile detention, things like that.
That being said, do you think our criminal system is successful at rehabilitating people?
I think most of the time it's not. Um, a lot of the time, the people who end up going to prison aren't people who are maybe violent to begin with. They might be people who have mental health issues. They might be people who were living on the street. They might be people who were drug addicted. And instead of giving them the type of help that they need, and rehabilitating them. They just lock them in a cell, don't give them the proper health care. They don't, make sure that they're able to keep proper hygiene. They don't make sure that they're able to see a therapist or see people who are interested in helping them change. Um, and so I would say it's definitely not successful at rehabilitating people.
Why do you think that there's this issue with reincarceration in the United States?
I think that there's a recidivism issue in the US because, like I said, the prison system does not help to rehabilitate people. And when people come out, they're stigmatized to the point where they can't find a job, they can't find housing. They're actually not allowed to return to the community where they might have committed the crime. And so that means that they're being taken away from the only people that they actually know. They're being taken away from the community where they may have grown up. They're being taken away from the community where they might have been able to find some sort of help or find a job. And because of that, a lot of people end up, without the ability to pay for housing, without the ability to keep a roof over their heads, or to even find a job. And so the only other option is to turn back to crime and to go back to prison because all of their other options have been taken away from them. And this is something that is by design. It's like once you have made this sort of like mistake, you're marked for life. And so it kind of takes people from being citizens, normal citizens like you and I, to being reduced to second class citizens, people who have no rights, people who essentially, like the way that the state views it, the way the prison system might view it is that, people don't deserve second chances. And that's the reality of it when people come out. So it's like if you're not going to be treated as a person when you're outside, like at least you can get things like meals every day, and at least you can, that you're going to be able to take a shower, you're going to be able to, do different like those things. Like if you're in federal lockup, you know that you're going to be able to have some of your needs met, whereas if you're on the outside, you're completely on your own. Um, and so that's also why I think that reentry is such an important thing. We need to have people who are willing to step in and help guide people. Yeah, just to change their lives and change their circumstances and get housing and, try to move on from the past.
You mentioned that criminalized people tend to deal with a lot of stigma. Do you like have any like where do you think that it comes from?
It starts with things like propaganda. And I don't know if I think you should be familiar with the term propaganda from the summer camp, but if you're not, essentially it is this complex that we have of media stories, things like the news, things like, you know, CSI Miami or like Law and Order SVU, where you see cops being praised in certain kinds of ways and being propped up as like heroes. Um, while the people um that they're going after, like the perpetrators, are being like they're being viewed as, people who are the lowest in society, people who are evil, people who are um just not good people, right? And so those kinds of things become internalized in the general public, right? Um, and those are the kinds of things that lead to people not being viewed in favorable ways once they get out. Um, which is why, people try to, um, don't give formerly incarcerated people jobs. They won't, rent housing to them. Um, and it's kind of like a scarlet letter that like, um, follows people for a very long time. And it's because of the way that people are portrayed on TV and in the media. That's kind of like the first place where people see like, okay, this is what a quote unquote criminal is. So this is a bad person. And if somebody has ever been to jail, I have to stay away from them. Otherwise, something bad is going to happen to me. Um, and so that's the kind of stigma that just like follows people around their entire lives.
Do you have any advice for kids my age on how they can stay out of this system?
Advice on how to stay out of this system. There are a lot of factors as to why somebody might, end up behind bars or not. Um, and Generally, the only thing that I can say is that in order to stay out of the system, you could be born white and you could be born wealthy. You could be born to people who have um, the ability to give you an education. You can be born to a family that has some sort of standing in the community, right? But we know that the factors of like race, class, gender, because men are more likely to go to prison, even though right now the number of women in prison is climbing very steadily. Um, we know that all of these things impact whether or not somebody is going to go to prison. Of course, there's programming to help young people decide, to make better choices when it comes to the things that they do. But I think it's really important to not put the blame on young people who have ended up um, behind bars by saying, okay, well, they could have just chosen a different path, um, because it's not necessarily that easy.
Why should reforming the legal system matter to people?
I think it should matter because it could literally be anyone, you know? It's like the chances of people making a series of bad mistakes, right, and ending up behind bars, it's way more likely than people can understand. Just like it's way more likely that you would end up being homeless than it is that you would end up being a billionaire. We kind of just have to look at it from the perspective of like, this person is in my community and this person deserves life. This person's a part of somebody else's community and they deserve life. This person is a human and they deserve a second chance. And that if I were in their situation, I would definitely want somebody to um, take a chance on me and help me do something different. You can't be a savior. You can't be like, I'm going to pick this person up. Like, no, they have to decide to do that for themselves if this is a situation that they've ended up in. However, I think that having really deep empathy for the people who are around you is something that is incredibly important in, you know, I mean, in all aspects of life, but especially when you're talking about mass incarceration and a system that literally just puts people away instead of doing anything at all to help them. Like we have to be the people that help them.
And if there is one thing that people take away from today's episode, what should it be?
If there's one thing that people should take away from today's episode, it's that going to prison or being somebody who has been incarcerated doesn't mean that you're a bad person. It doesn't mean that you're a violent person. It doesn't mean that you deserved to go to prison or jail. It doesn't mean that, your life should be over or is over. Um, and that we need to just have empathy for one another and try to understand the things that happen to put people in the situations that they've been put in. And also that, police are not our saviors, and we need to educate ourselves more on the things that they do to cause violence in our neighborhoods, and try to do what we can to stop that.
Thank you all for listening. I hope you got something out of it, even if it's just an interest in mass incarceration. Stay tuned for the next episode, which will feature Ophelia, a woman who has been incarcerated herself and started a women's reentry program while attending school and work full time. And remember, stay hopeful out there.